Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a quieter era, to a time when steam puffed gently from copper kettles and porcelain cups clinked softly in drawing rooms bathed in the glow of gas lamps. You're about to enter the world of Victorian England, where tea wasn't merely a drink. It was a philosophy, a ritual, even an obsession. A steaming cup of Earl Grey could solve almost any problem, from family quarrels to international diplomacy, or at least Victorians like to imagine it could. But as cozy as all this sounds, tonight's journey might challenge your sense of reason, and, brace yourself, you probably won't survive this tale awake. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and as you sink deeper into your pillows, let me know in the comments below where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly comforting knowing we're all drifting off at different times, scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle into a plush velvet armchair, tucked neatly in a warm Victorian drawing room. Outside, rain trickles softly down the window pane, creating thin rivulets that distort your view of gas lamps flickering gently in the misty street. Here, tea is more than just a drink. It's a centerpiece around which Victorian society quietly revolves. You can almost hear the faint whispering rustle of crinolines and the steady ticking of a distant grandfather clock marking a serene passage of time. For the Victorians, tea wasn't just comfort, it was civilization. Every sip of the amber liquid signified refinement, order, and progress. Tea was served with impeccable precision at set hours. None of that random microwave nonsense we rely on today. No, back then, rituals mattered, and precision was everything. The placement of teaspoons, the stirring direction, the exact steeping time. Each detail carried weight, each choice potentially speaking volumes about your character. Stir too quickly, and you risked social ruin. Sip too loudly, and eyebrows would rise in silent but potent judgment. You glance down at your own imaginary cup, and careful not to betray your modern-day barbarism, attempt the graceful swirling motion you've seen so often in period dramas. But even imaginary tea drinking demands an elegance that seems unfairly challenging at this late hour. Maybe you'd better leave it to the Victorians after all. In Victorian society, tea was also medicine, a gentle, restorative tonic credited with curing headaches, melancholy, and even mild indigestion. Doctors earnestly debated tea's therapeutic virtues, prescribing it liberally to patients as if it were liquid gold. The great thinkers of the age would pause their most heated intellectual arguments to carefully savor a warm, fragrant cup of Darjeeling, silently seeking clarity in the steam that rose from delicate china cups. It's tempting to think Victorians overestimated tea's powers. Then again, have you ever seen a grumpy Victorian? Precisely. This genteel tea obsession went beyond social customs and medicinal remedies. It seeped into every aspect of Victorian life, even, improbably, into engineering. Imagine, for a moment, Victorian engineers, mustachioed men in waistcoats, perched solemnly in drafty lecture halls, notebooks in hand, taking careful notes during tedious lectures about tension, compression, and something ominously named shearing forces. At first glance, the thought of tea playing any role here feels like whimsical nonsense. And yet, these solemn, waistcoat-clad men found inspiration for their structures not in textbooks alone, but within the humble, swirling patterns formed by loose tea leaves settling quietly at the bottom of their cups. You might think it sounds like nonsense, some Victorian-era pseudoscience dreamed up in smoky salons over brandy and biscuits. But scientists still argue whether the Victorians knowingly derived genuine scientific insight from their tea habits, or if it was simply coincidence. Either way, tea patterns, the delicate swirl of floating leaves gently settling into intricate formations, captivated their attention. Victorians adored patterns. They saw elegance and reason embedded in every curve, spiral, or geometric shape, evidence of nature's impeccable order. Tea leaves, obediently drifting into predictable patterns, seemed proof that even chaos adhered to universal laws. It's mildly amusing to picture these dignified engineers, famed for their rigid adherence to logic, staring intently into teacups, earnestly hoping for inspiration. But Victorians were an imaginative bunch, even if they'd have insisted their observations were entirely rational and scientific. Indeed, their imagination was so robust that even bridges, the most industrial and practical of structures, found inspiration in teacups. Of course, Victorians had other peculiar obsessions too: fern collecting, extravagant facial hair, the morbid beauty of mourning jewelry made from human hair. But tea had a uniquely universal appeal. It was the era's greatest equalizer, enjoyed equally by aristocrats and chimney sweeps, philosophers and street hawkers. No matter your rank or station, the promise of tea united everyone in a shared moment of quiet, refined reflection. Even the most eccentric theories and inspirations could seem plausible when discussed calmly over a steaming cup. As you sink deeper into your imaginary armchair, picturing those Victorian engineers lost in contemplation, you might gently smile at their earnestness. But perhaps they were onto something. After all, there is a certain calm, meditative quality to watching tea leaves slowly drift and settle. Maybe tonight, as your own thoughts drift gently into the slow, swirling darkness of sleep, you'll find yourself quietly inspired too. Perhaps tomorrow you'll see patterns in places you never imagined, like your cereal bowl or your coffee grounds, because inspiration, just like tea, is wonderfully unpredictable. For now, though, simply let your mind rest on the comforting absurdity of those Victorian visionaries, patiently awaiting revelation at the bottom of a teacup. The rain still taps softly against the window, and your eyelids grow heavy, coaxing you closer and closer to sleep. You remain comfortably nestled in your imaginary Victorian drawing room, the gentle patter of rain tapping softly against the window pane. Outside, gas lamps continue their calm, flickering dance, casting shadows across cobblestone streets, now glistening wet in the evening drizzle. Inside, warmth radiates softly from an ornate fireplace, and steam rises from the porcelain teapot resting patiently nearby. As you linger in this cozy, timeless scene, the connection between tea and bridge design quietly deepens. Victorians had a peculiar knack for noticing the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated things. To the modern eye, the leap from tea drinking to structural engineering might feel vast, if not outright baffling. Yet, in the calm stillness of their drawing rooms, amid murmured conversations and clinking porcelain, Victorians recognized something intriguing happening in their teacups. Picture yourself leaning slightly forward, peering gently into your own cup. The amber liquid swirls lazily, tiny flecks of tea leaves dancing and twirling silently beneath the surface. As you set the cup down and patiently wait, you observe the leaves slowly settle to the bottom, arranging themselves into delicate, seemingly intentional formations. Spirals, clusters, gentle arcs, patterns formed effortlessly by chance and fluid dynamics. It was exactly this subtle dance that intrigued Victorian engineers, who, like you, found themselves mesmerized by such delicate complexity. These engineers, scholars of iron, wood, and stone, often wrestled with structural puzzles late into the night. How to best support massive weight, how to distribute tension evenly, how to resist the relentless pull of gravity. Oddly enough, answers seemed elusive until one evening, likely filled with frustration, a weary engineer glanced casually into his teacup, finding unexpected clarity. Legend has it, and Victorians were famously fond of their gentle legends, that one such engineer noticed how tea leaves clustered along specific paths, forming intricate yet stable patterns at the bottom of his porcelain cup. A flash of intuition struck him. Could the same natural process guiding these delicate formations also guide stronger, more resilient bridge designs? As strange as it may sound, this fleeting inspiration quickly took hold within engineering circles. Soon, respectable lectures featured earnest professors demonstrating how tea leaves naturally mapped patterns of efficient stress distribution. Serious-looking Victorian gentlemen, their handlebar mustaches impeccably groomed, would nod thoughtfully and jot notes into leather-bound journals, noting correlations between tea leaf patterns and their equations scribbled in chalk. It must have seemed wonderfully absurd, but then, Victorians found a peculiar dignity in absurdity. If you find yourself mildly skeptical, you're not alone. Modern engineers sometimes still raise polite eyebrows at these tea leaf methods. Scientists still argue whether this moment truly marked a turning point in structural engineering or simply reflected a quirky Victorian fascination that happily coincided with emerging theories of fluid dynamics. Either way, Victorians embraced the idea wholeheartedly, convinced they'd discovered yet another hidden order, quietly whispering within nature's chaos. In Victorian England, tea drinking and scientific innovation were hardly strangers. Afternoon tea gatherings frequently doubled as informal symposiums, places where gentlemen, and increasingly ladies, would debate physics, biology, and even civil engineering principles with quiet enthusiasm. Tea had a unique power to gently dissolve social barriers, opening minds to creative connections that strict lecture halls often missed. And so the humble tea leaf, suspended briefly in liquid, found itself at the unlikely crossroads of polite society and cutting-edge engineering. This Victorian openness to finding connections in ordinary places wasn't limited to tea leaves. Consider the famed Victorian polymath Sir Francis Galton, who famously stared into crowds, trying to discern mathematical patterns in everyday human movement. Or Lord Kelvin, who saw thermodynamic truths reflected casually in swirling currents of cream poured into his morning coffee. Victorians seemed instinctively to grasp something profound. The universe, complex as it is, speaks its truths clearly in simple things, like the graceful settling of tea leaves. Now, sipping from your imaginary cup, you might wonder why Victorians felt compelled to draw inspiration from such gentle patterns. The answer is soothingly straightforward. Their world was rapidly industrializing, increasingly complex, even chaotic. Trains thundered through countryside once quiet, factories belched smoke into once clear skies, and cities expanded in all directions, bustling with unprecedented energy. In response, Victorians craved order, reassurance, and certainty, qualities easily found in nature's subtle harmony. Tea leaf patterns, gentle and predictable, reassured them that amidst industrial upheaval, nature still whispered wisdom to those patient enough to listen. Imagine the comfort these engineers found, returning each evening to drawing rooms where porcelain cups patiently awaited them. There, amid soft chatter, gentle laughter, and perhaps an occasional mildly sarcastic remark about someone's overly ambitious mustache, inspiration quietly flowed. The swirling tea leaves whispered answers, guiding hands that would later sketch designs destined for greatness, stately bridges that would span turbulent rivers, connecting cities, communities, and lives. As you lean back in your velvet armchair, slowly savoring the delightful absurdity of it all, you might chuckle softly to yourself. Today, we use supercomputers and advanced algorithms, yet Victorians, seated comfortably amid tea trays and crumpets, derived wisdom from the humble tea leaf. Perhaps there's a lesson in that gentle absurdity. Sometimes inspiration arrives not in complicated equations or elaborate experiments, but in quiet moments spent noticing simple details. As sleep begins softly tugging at your consciousness, you let your mind drift once more toward those patient Victorians, gazing into their teacups with earnest curiosity. You picture them nodding solemnly, convinced they're glimpsing universal secrets at the bottom of delicate porcelain vessels. Tonight, your imagination drifts lazily along with theirs, reassured that sometimes the most profound insights arrive quietly, unhurriedly, just as softly settling tea leaves find their resting place at the bottom of your cup. The rain outside continues its soft serenade, inviting you further into gentle repose, and as your eyelids grow heavier, you find yourself comfortably embracing the calming absurdity of tea-inspired engineering. Who knows? Perhaps tomorrow morning, while sipping your own tea or coffee, if you're feeling rebelliously modern, you'll spot patterns of your own, gentle secrets whispered quietly from cup to consciousness. For tonight, though, simply let yourself drift deeper into the soothing rhythm of Victorian tea and quietly settle, just like those softly swirling leaves, into peace. You're still nestled gently in the plush velvet comfort of your imaginary Victorian drawing room. Outside, rain softly taps the window pane, a rhythmic reminder of the tranquil world you've stepped into. Your attention drifts lazily from the warmth of the fireplace toward the teacup resting quietly in your hand. In its smooth porcelain depths, delicate leaves continue their graceful descent, forming subtle patterns that whisper quiet hints about the natural world. Tonight, tea isn't just tea. It's a silent teacher, patiently illustrating principles that Victorian engineers eagerly absorbed. To truly appreciate their fascination, you lean closer, peering gently into the cup, watching the leaves settle into soft spirals and arcs. It's oddly calming, like watching clouds drift across a lazy summer sky, shapes forming and dissolving without haste or hurry. Those tea leaves aren't just randomly arranged. They follow gentle yet precise natural laws. As hot water cools in your cup, tiny currents form, guiding the leaves into neat clusters. This is the quiet dance of fluid dynamics, an elegant science describing how liquids flow and interact. Though Victorian engineers might not have fully understood the detailed physics at play, they intuitively grasped the fundamental truth. Nature arranges itself into stable patterns, creating quiet strength through subtle order. You glance thoughtfully toward your imaginary bookshelf, its polished wooden shelves lined with thick, leather-bound volumes, perhaps filled with neatly sketched diagrams and earnest explanations of physics and mathematics. Victorian scientists adored such meticulous documentation, yet often found inspiration not in these heavy tomes, but in moments of quiet contemplation, like the slow settling of tea leaves. Nature's subtlety seemed far more powerful than any textbook formula. One particularly curious principle Victorian engineers noticed in their teacups was something scientists call self-organization, the surprising way complex patterns spontaneously emerge from seemingly chaotic conditions. You see this everywhere in nature. Snowflakes forming their intricate shapes without a guiding hand, sand dunes sculpted by gentle winds, even flocking birds aligning perfectly in flight. Each scenario reflects order gently emerging from chaos, quietly reassuring us that stability is nature's preferred state. Victorian engineers were quietly thrilled by this idea. To them, the spontaneous patterns of tea leaves offered intriguing clues for building bridges that mimicked nature's efficiency. Traditional bridge designs of the era were sturdy but somewhat rigid, relying heavily on brute strength rather than graceful, flexible stability. Tea leaves hinted at a different approach, one that favored balance, gentle alignment, and natural elegance. Imagine, if you will, engineers meticulously sketching patterns observed in their teacups, carefully noting where leaves clustered most densely and where they thinned out. Such observations might have seemed delightfully eccentric, yet they yielded real insights. Engineers realized that strength didn't come merely from more material. It arose from thoughtful distribution, creating networks that evenly dispersed tension and stress. It's rather comforting to think that today's complex structural systems trace their lineage back to quiet Victorian afternoons spent pondering tea leaves. There's a softly amusing debate about how intentional these Victorian observations were. Scientists still argue whether engineers consciously applied tea leaf-inspired patterns or if these patterns merely resonated subconsciously, nudging them toward better designs without explicit recognition. Either way, their structures gradually took on more organic forms, elegantly mimicking nature's quiet sophistication. You might pause here, quietly smiling at the mild absurdity, bridges subtly shaped by tea leaves. But nature's wisdom often appears gently absurd at first glance. Consider the honeycomb structure created by bees, strong, efficient, yet simple. Victorians, with their love of patterns, marveled at such natural wonders. Honeycombs, fern fronds, even soap bubbles became models of structural excellence. Why not tea leaves? Modern engineering confirms Victorians were quietly insightful. Engineers now routinely look to nature for structural inspiration, a practice formerly known as biomimicry. Today, you see it everywhere. Buildings resembling trees to maximize strength and flexibility, aerodynamic vehicles echoing bird wings, and even textiles designed after shark skin to reduce friction. But quietly, beneath all these contemporary marvels, lies a debt to those Victorian dreamers who saw profound wisdom in a swirling cup of tea. Returning your attention to the teacup in your hand, you gently tilt it, watching leaves shift slightly, rearranging themselves once more. Each subtle movement echoes the quiet laws of physics Victorians so admired. You begin to appreciate their insight, not because they were scientifically flawless, but precisely because they were willing to find serious lessons in simple pleasures. Victorians delighted in such small details partly due to the slow pace of their world. While ours rushes forward, propelled by urgency and instant gratification, theirs flowed gently, leaving ample room for contemplation. Afternoon tea wasn't a hurried break. It was an invitation to pause, notice, and reflect. Through those unhurried moments, wisdom seeped quietly into their consciousness, shaping their designs and indeed their entire worldview. So perhaps, you muse sleepily, we might learn something from these tea-obsessed Victorians. Our busy modern lives rarely leave room for leisurely reflection, but as you relax deeper into your imaginary armchair, you sense their gentle reminder. Wisdom rarely arrives loudly. It whispers softly, patiently waiting until we're quiet enough to hear. The rain outside continues its gentle serenade, each drop a tiny reminder of nature's unhurried rhythm. You feel sleep edging closer, drawing you gently toward rest. Perhaps tonight your dreams will feature graceful Victorian bridges arching softly above rivers, their gentle curves inspired directly by swirling tea leaves. Maybe you'll awaken tomorrow noticing quiet patterns everywhere, the swirl of milk in your coffee, shadows cast by sunlight, or leaves drifting lazily onto sidewalks. For now, though, allow yourself simply to appreciate the subtle elegance Victorians found in tea leaf patterns, gently reminding you that strength often lies in quiet simplicity. As your thoughts grow quieter, matching the softening patter of rain, you let yourself drift gently toward sleep, carried along by comforting memories of Victorians patiently discovering structural truths hidden neatly within porcelain teacups. You remain comfortably seated in your imaginary Victorian drawing room, the warm glow of gas lamps softly illuminating the space around you. The gentle patter of rain outside continues its steady rhythm, a comforting backdrop to your journey deeper into Victorian bridge-building secrets. Now, your focus shifts gently from tea leaves themselves to the careful, quiet art of traditional Victorian bridge construction. Those solid, graceful structures quietly defying gravity above winding rivers and gentle valleys. Victorians took bridges seriously. They saw them as vital arteries, connecting communities and quietly fueling the bustling engines of their industrial age. You picture engineers in stiff collars and waistcoats, pens scratching methodically across thick, ivory-colored pages, calculating stresses and tensions with meticulous care. Yet, despite all their formal rigor, Victorians occasionally found themselves pleasantly sidetracked by gentle inspirations, like swirling tea leaves. These little distractions didn't replace their disciplined calculations. Rather, they complemented and quietly enriched their understanding of structural harmony. Imagine yourself strolling quietly along a misty riverside, watching workers carefully erect stone piers, layer by patient layer. Wooden scaffolding rises above you, supporting arches and trusses as they take shape. Victorian bridge builders typically relied upon three simple yet fundamental concepts: compression, tension, and balance. Each concept quietly governed every decision, from choosing materials to shaping individual beams and arches. Compression, as you gently recall, is simply the force of pressing inward, squeezing materials together. Stone, heavy and solid, handles compression beautifully. Its very weight pressing stones tightly into one another, quietly increasing stability. You might picture this vividly by thinking of stacked books pressed downward, each one reinforcing the stability of the ones below. Victorians loved stone precisely because it understood compression so naturally. Then there's tension, the opposite force, pulling materials apart, stretching them gently but insistently. Unlike stone, wood, and iron excelled at managing tension, their fibers and grains flexing gracefully under pressure. Victorian engineers intuitively matched material strengths to these invisible forces, quietly creating structures that worked harmoniously with nature's gentle tugging and pushing. Balance, though perhaps obvious, was essential. Without careful equilibrium, even the most elegantly designed bridges would collapse gracefully, though perhaps graceful is too kind a description for a collapsing bridge. Victorians were mildly obsessed with achieving perfect balance, and who could blame them? Balance ensured safety, longevity, and crucially, dignity. Imagine the embarrassment of a bridge quietly toppling into a peaceful river, surely the social scandal of the season. You might gently smile picturing stern-faced Victorian engineers nervously sipping tea while quietly contemplating the terrifying consequences of imbalance. And yet, balance was more than structural. It was philosophical. Victorians believed deeply in harmony between progress and tradition, innovation and restraint. Bridges symbolized this philosophy beautifully, joining new territories without disturbing existing landscapes, blending modern strength with timeless elegance. But even with their deep appreciation for these traditional principles, Victorian engineers were quietly captivated by the fresh inspiration tea leaves offered. Traditional bridges, though sturdy, often looked somewhat rigid, impressive yet visibly strained by their own weight. Tea leaves, on the other hand, suggested more organic, flowing designs, structures that distributed tension and compression with elegant subtlety. Picture yourself quietly inspecting detailed blueprints, inked with care and precision. Alongside standard designs, arches, piers, and trusses, you might notice gentle, swirling annotations reminiscent of tea leaf clusters. Here and there, Victorian engineers quietly incorporated these organic patterns, exploring how softly curved lines and carefully placed clusters could efficiently distribute forces. Today, we might call this innovative, organic design. Victorians simply called it sensible. Yet, there remains quiet debate about how consciously Victorians applied these tea-inspired ideas. Scientists still argue whether their bridge designs genuinely derived from tea leaf patterns or if these subtle echoes emerged subconsciously, reflecting deeper, intuitive understandings of nature's principles. Either way, the structures Victorians created spoke gently yet convincingly of their thoughtful approach. Quietly, your imagination now wanders to famous Victorian bridges, like London's Tower Bridge or Bristol's Clifton Suspension Bridge. You see clearly the subtle elegance hidden within their robust frameworks. These structures aren't just functional marvels, they're quiet, dignified statements of Victorian confidence. Confident enough, in fact, to incorporate something as whimsical as inspiration from teacups. But it wasn't just monumental bridges where tea-inspired ingenuity surfaced. Small footbridges in tranquil parks or simple stone arches spanning village streams benefited equally from these quiet revelations. Victorians understood intuitively that great engineering wasn't always grandiose. Sometimes brilliance lies in modest, subtle choices. In fact, perhaps the most charming aspect of Victorian bridge building was precisely this humility. While modern structures often strive for boldness, loudly declaring their technological prowess, Victorians preferred quieter confidence. Their bridges stood patiently, gracefully defying gravity without unnecessary showmanship, just like tea leaves quietly settling, forming patterns without fanfare or fuss. As sleep edges closer, you softly picture yourself once more standing beneath one of these Victorian bridges, looking upward at the graceful arch curving gently against the cloudy sky. Raindrops continue their delicate symphony, landing softly on stone and metal alike, gently reminding you of balance and harmony. The Victorians understood that true strength lies in quiet subtlety, careful design, and gentle alignment with nature. Tonight, your imagination gently appreciates how tea leaves and Victorian bridge builders share a quiet, humble wisdom. Both understand the delicate dance between chaos and order, tension and relaxation. Perhaps tomorrow, when you cross a bridge, any bridge, you might pause briefly, remembering the quiet inspiration Victorians found in simple, swirling tea leaves. But for now, let yourself drift deeper into peaceful rest, comforted by the gentle absurdity of it all. Allow your thoughts to slow, matching the rhythmic raindrops, softly whispering their lullaby outside. You quietly sense that tonight, like those Victorian tea leaves settling gently at the bottom of porcelain cups, you too are easing into perfect, restful balance. The fire in your imaginary Victorian drawing room has settled into a slow, steady glow, casting amber shadows that flicker lazily along the carved wood panels and paisley drapes. You gently lift your teacup again, its contents now lukewarm, leaves resting quietly at the bottom like tired dancers after a long performance. Tonight, you're slipping even further into the minds of Victorian engineers, but this time you're sitting beside them. Literally, you're there in the tea room, seated at a small, round mahogany table with doilies, sugar cubes, and just enough social awkwardness to require precisely measured small talk. You're joining a discussion where concepts of physics are stirred into conversation like milk into tea, gracefully and with just a hint of unnecessary ceremony. These were the conversations where bridges were dreamed up, not at construction sites or in noisy foundries, but in parlors and sitting rooms over steaming cups and delicate cakes. The overlap between domestic tea culture and scientific discovery may seem quaint, but the Victorians didn't see it that way. Tea was both a ritual and a mental reset. After long hours of meticulous calculations and dusty blueprints, engineers would retreat into social tea rooms, where ideas were shared not with urgency, but with civility, and sometimes a biscuit. And there, amid the clinking of silver spoons and the soft hush of conversation, the lines between domestic comfort and mechanical invention blurred. You sit back, watching an elderly gentleman in a waistcoat adjust his spectacles, speaking softly about a load-bearing truss inspired by floating fennel. Someone across the table chuckles gently, then suggests how fluid displacement in a saucer might mimic riverbed erosion. It's absurd, but somehow compelling. The conversations don't always lead anywhere, but they're not meant to. The Victorians believed firmly in mental wandering, the gentle stroll through an idea rather than a mad dash toward a solution. One of the most fascinating things about this era was the way people accepted inspiration from wherever it appeared, even if it looked, to modern minds, like nonsense. For instance, did you know some engineers actually theorized that the way milk mixed with tea could reveal optimal liquid flow for iron suspension cables? Scientists still argue whether these theories held any real value or if they were just the 19th century version of TED Talks with extra sugar. The idea wasn't that every swirl of cream unveiled universal truth, but that the natural world, be it in bridges or beverages, always had something to teach you if you slowed down enough to observe. And of course, slow was the name of the game. No phones buzzed, no screens flickered. A thought could take a full minute to form, 2 more to articulate, and 5 to be politely disagreed with by someone quoting Newton, very slowly. Victorian engineers brought this deliberateness into their structural designs. They didn't just draw beams and bolts. They imagined the stresses, the strains, the lives their bridges would support. Over tea, they'd speak of the bridge not as a dead structure, but as a living system of opposing forces. Tension and compression weren't problems. They were dance partners, learning to move in harmony. And the swirling leaves at the bottom of the cup? A quiet dress rehearsal for this dance. You might even say the tea room acted as a primitive simulation lab, albeit one filled with silk gloves and floral wallpaper. Observations were casual, but the conclusions were quietly profound. Watching the curved meniscus of tea at the edge of a cup led to musings about arch strength. Studying how sugar slowly dissolved prompted discussions about erosion over time. A dripping teapot could spark a theory about fluid pressure in siphons. This was bedtime science before bedtime stories became industrialized, soft, speculative, and only occasionally ridiculous. And make no mistake, sometimes it was ridiculous. There were debates over whether adding lemon altered the fluid dynamics enough to invalidate one's observational data. One engineer even insisted on stirring only counterclockwise, believing clockwise motions introduced a flawed vortex bias. You raise a skeptical eyebrow, but then again, scientists today still argue about string theory, so perhaps every era has its quirks. You lean back again, the scene fading into warm candlelight and gentle conversation. The Victorian belief in finding science in the everyday wasn't just charming, it was quietly revolutionary. They didn't require sterile labs or government grants to seek truth. They simply needed curiosity, a teacup, and time. In fact, time might have been their most powerful tool, time to observe, reflect, and revise. This leisurely pace is something we rarely afford ourselves today. Modern life demands urgency, instant results, and productivity metrics that track how many hours we've been awake. But the Victorians? They found productivity in stillness. Their greatest insights often emerged not while they were solving problems, but while they were avoiding them, with a cup in hand and steam rising slowly toward the chandelier. Now, as your thoughts begin to swirl as lazily as the tea in your mind's eye, you start to realize inspiration isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper, curling upward with steam. And maybe, just maybe, the most elegant bridge designs were born not from graphite and girders, but from gentle pauses between sips when an idea finally settled, just like a tea leaf drifting softly to the bottom of the cup. Let that thought settle with you now as your breathing slows, matching the cadence of distant raindrops and the flickering shadows on the wallpaper. Let the absurd yet oddly logical world of Victorian tea engineering fill your imagination as you drift a little further from wakefulness. Because in the end, you may not remember the exact theories or the names of trusses or tensile forces, but you'll remember the feeling that something magical can happen when you slow down and simply observe what your teacup has to say. Your teacup rests now, undisturbed, the leaves at the bottom forming what might be a swirling question mark, or perhaps just a sleepy fern. It's getting harder to tell. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, filling your Victorian drawing room with a faint, woody scent like burnt cinnamon and old libraries. You're in no rush. Tonight, you drift deeper into a strangely polite scientific disagreement, a quiet but persistent debate over whether those swirling tea leaf patterns genuinely changed the trajectory of bridge engineering, or were simply the charming distractions of men with too much time and not enough caffeine. You listen in, figuratively of course, as two Victorian engineers politely bicker over their tea. One, a man with fantastically unruly sideburns, insists that his use of tea leaf-inspired curves in his truss design improved both aesthetic appeal and load distribution. The other, adjusting his monocle with measured disdain, questions whether any of it could be scientifically verified. Correlation is not causation, he mutters, perhaps 100 years before that phrase becomes fashionable. This is where things get interesting. Scientists still argue whether the teacup actually taught the Victorians anything new, or whether it merely confirmed things they already suspected. After all, bridge design had long relied on intuitive understandings of force and balance. Arches had been around since ancient Rome. The physics of compression and tension weren't discovered over biscuits, and yet the tea leaf became an oddly poetic symbol, a muse, if you will, for a generation of builders hoping to make sense of the industrial chaos unfolding around them. You lean back, amused by how such a simple object stirred such disproportionate debate. Some argued that the swirling patterns at the bottom of a cup mirrored the mathematical curves seen in nature, spirals, vortices, parabolas, all of which held relevance in engineering. The question was, did the engineers recognize that? Or were they simply romantics, assigning significance to something that just felt smart? Take, for example, the reverse flow theory one engineer proposed, based solely on watching cream being poured into tea. He claimed the outward ripples resembled the spread of structural stress in bridge decking. Did it hold up under peer review? Well, no. But it earned him a polite applause at the Royal Society and a scone, so that counts for something. It's worth noting that Victorians were especially fond of what might generously be called soft data. They loved anecdotal evidence, poetic metaphor, and theories that walked a fine line between empirical and whimsical. This wasn't laziness. It was part of a broader cultural belief that science and art could, and should, hold hands under the drawing room chandelier. Even in modern times, we haven't completely moved on. Scientists still explore phenomena with no guarantee of relevance: quantum fluctuations, dark matter, the social behavior of slime molds. Engineers design bridges inspired by bones, trees, and even origami. The difference? We now call it biomimicry and write papers with 30 references. Victorians called it having an idea over tea. But despite the lack of rigorous scientific consensus, some real-world examples began to emerge. Engineers experimented with bridge components that mimicked natural curves and branching structures, closely resembling the way tea leaves spread in cooled liquid. The results? Some were structural marvels, others less so. One charming disaster involved a footbridge designed with a spiral twist inspired by, yes, a particularly lively Assam blend. The bridge twisted too literally and collapsed on its second day. No one was harmed, unless you count egos. Still, the tea-inspired debates persisted. Some argued that even if the science was loose, the inspiration mattered. These calming rituals, these slow, quiet observations, opened up mental pathways that rigid formulas couldn't. After all, not every breakthrough is born in a lab. Sometimes it arises in the space between two sips, in the flicker of candlelight across patterned wallpaper, when the mind is soft and receptive, not racing toward a deadline. And isn't that still true? How many good ideas come not when you're staring directly at a problem, but when you're walking, daydreaming, or sipping something warm on a quiet afternoon? Maybe we all have a little Victorian engineer in us, finding connections where others see only coincidence. Even today, scientists remain divided. Some insist there's no real link between tea leaves and bridge mechanics, beyond whimsical analogy. Others argue that those analogies paved the way for a more intuitive understanding of structural balance, especially at a time when formal simulations didn't exist. Engineers had no AutoCAD, no 3D modeling, no AI-assisted load testing. They had pencils, and tea, and time. So perhaps the question isn't whether tea leaves objectively reshaped Victorian engineering, but whether they created the right mental space for better thinking. They slowed things down, gave minds something gentle to focus on. A microcosm of swirling order in a cup, a soft visual metaphor for the forces those engineers were trying to tame on a much grander scale. You breathe in slowly, the scent of bergamot imaginary but oddly comforting. As the debate fades into candlelight and steam, you realize that, like most good arguments, this one might never be fully resolved. And that's okay. Not everything needs a conclusion to be useful. Some ideas are meant to hover, to swirl like leaves in cooling tea, quietly influencing without demanding credit. So tonight, you let go of needing answers. You simply appreciate the quiet charm of this disagreement, a debate without shouting, without anger, without hashtags. Just two people, one idea, and a cup of tea settling into calm, patterned silence. And as your breathing matches that silence, your mind drifts a little further from the waking world. Let the gentle dispute echo softly in your dreams, a murmured discussion about tea, tension, and Victorian bridges, floating through your thoughts like steam through the rafters of a candlelit room. The room grows quieter still. The fire now flickers low, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the carpeted floor. Your teacup rests in your hands, cool now, the leaves settled completely, like little geological fossils at the bottom of your evening ritual. Tonight, you drift gently toward one of the more curious aspects of Victorian engineering, how those engineers, fueled by imagination and a fair amount of Darjeeling, began comparing their bridge designs to the very structures of tea leaves themselves. Now, you wouldn't be alone in wondering, what could a tea leaf possibly have in common with a steel truss? One is delicate, practically dissolving in water. The other must bear the weight of carriages, foot traffic, and the occasional elephant parade. But to the Victorian mind, this wasn't absurd. It was poetic logic. They began to notice how tea leaves often arranged themselves in branching patterns, curved spines with smaller veins reaching outward, echoing the structures found in nature, fern leaves, trees, even river deltas. These formations weren't just pretty. They hinted at something deeper, how tension distributes through organic forms. A tea leaf, after all, survives storms not by resisting wind with brute strength, but by bending, yielding, and dispersing stress along its veins. Victorian engineers saw this and thought, why shouldn't bridges do the same? You lean in, imagining them sketching the pattern of a tea leaf beside their standard triangle-based trusses. Then, rather daringly, they'd overlay one on the other. The resulting designs began to shift. Straight lines gave way to gentle curves. Dense intersections of iron mimicked the central spine of a leaf. Beams were arranged more like branching veins, distributing load with a quiet elegance. And suddenly, Bridges no longer looked like rectangles bolted together in frustration. They began to resemble nature itself. One particularly eccentric engineer, let's call him Mr. Hollingsworth, because of course that was his name, took this idea further. He claimed that the microscopic structure of dried tea leaves mirrored the cellular lattice of structural steel. Now, was he correct? Not entirely. But did he publish a 56-page treatise on it, complete with illustrations and a dedication to his cat? Absolutely. Scientists today still roll their eyes at some of these more enthusiastic comparisons, but even in their skepticism, they acknowledge a strange truth. Some Victorian bridges built using these branching, tea-inspired patterns actually worked better. The distribution of tension was more natural. The materials lasted longer. And, importantly, the structures were prettier. Say what you will about Victorian excess, but if they were going to build something, it was going to look nice, preferably with some wrought iron flourishes and maybe a gargoyle or two. Let's slow down now and consider the materials they used. Stone was ancient, trustworthy, and strong under compression, but entirely unhelpful under tension. Steel, however, was new, well, newish, and thrilling. It could bend, it could stretch, it could shimmer in the sun and hold the weight of steam trains. But it was tricky. Misused, steel could buckle or snap. It needed thoughtful arrangement, an internal logic to guide the stress of motion and weather. That's where tea leaf thinking came in. Instead of slapping together iron beams in a hasty grid, Victorian engineers began to consider the path of load, how force flowed across a bridge the way sap moves through a leaf. They even drew little arrows, labeled tension here and compression there, as if narrating the bridge's secret emotional journey. One bridge in particular, a lovely little span in Yorkshire, was nicknamed the Teacup Truss by locals. It wasn't official, of course, but everyone knew the engineer drank lapsang souchong like it was water and claimed it had instructed him on where to place the diagonal supports. Modern engineers reviewing these designs today might smile, gently amused. Some of the logic holds up, others, not so much. But the point wasn't always accuracy, it was intuition. The Victorians trusted their senses, their metaphors, their long, slow conversations about leaves and girders and the poetic architecture of the world. And really, who's to say that's wrong? Even today, structural engineers look to spider webs, bone structures, and bird nests for inspiration. If you've ever admired the Eiffel Tower's lattice or the curves of a suspension bridge, you're seeing echoes of that same biomimicry, a belief that nature has already figured out most of what we're struggling to build. Scientists still argue whether the tea leaf influence was structural or merely stylistic. Did these bridges stand because of their biological mimicry or in spite of it? It's an open question, with gentle nods on both sides. What's certain is that the leaf-like elegance gave Victorian bridges a grace unmatched by purely utilitarian designs. They became not just paths over water, but symbols, silent poems in iron and stone. And you, still seated quietly in your upholstered chair, feel that symbolism settling over you like a warm shawl. The idea that something so fragile as a tea leaf could influence the great hulking frameworks of human progress, it's strangely soothing. It whispers that perhaps, just perhaps, gentleness and strength aren't opposites. So tonight as you drift, you carry this thought into the edges of sleep. That strength can curve, tension can flow, and design can be taught by the smallest things. Maybe you'll never build a bridge, but tomorrow, when you stir your tea, you might pause just a moment longer, watching the leaves swirl gently, wondering what they're trying to tell you. For now, though, the leaves have settled. Your thoughts follow suit. No diagrams, no measurements, just the quiet, branching logic of sleep. The fire is low now, a faint orange glow humming behind the grate. Your imaginary drawing room has grown still, the kind of stillness that arrives only when the world outside has truly gone to bed. You're half dreaming already, curled under the weight of velvet thoughts and the warmth of Victorian absurdities. But we're not quite done. Not until we cross the most daring of their tea-inspired accomplishments, the suspension bridge. Now, suspension bridges may seem like modern marvels, swooping, sleek, heroic structures that span impossible distances with barely a shrug. But their roots stretch far deeper, and the Victorians, with their tea and trusses and tendency to find grandeur in the mundane, quietly revolutionized this form of bridge building with inspirations drawn not just from the industrial age, but from the delicate balance found in nature, and yes, even in a cup of tea. You're standing now, sleepily, in the damp morning fog beside one such bridge, its great iron chains drooping like the eyelids of someone who stayed up far too late reading poetry. The bridge is graceful, elegant, effortless, and impossibly complex. It hangs from tension alone, no solid arches or sturdy columns below, just cable and curve and the soft hum of wind through steel. Victorian engineers adored the suspension bridge not only for its utility, but for its aesthetic. It looked like it shouldn't work, like a spell held together with whispers and hope. And so, naturally, they found themselves asking, how do we tame such delicate balance? Where should the cables bend? Where should they anchor? And how should we arrange these flowing lines of force? They turned, once more, to the patterns they saw daily, tea leaves floating, then settling, in smooth arcs toward the center of a still cup. To them, it resembled the way weight distributes across a flexible bridge. The heavier the load, the deeper the sag, the more evenly spread the tension. Suspension bridges, like tea leaves in motion, are governed not by brute strength, but by graceful flow. Engineers noticed that when tea was stirred, and then left alone, the swirling leaves would often settle in a gentle spiral along the edge of the cup, and then gradually drift inward toward the center. This curious motion, now recognized as a phenomenon called the secondary flow of fluid in a rotating system, wasn't fully understood at the time. But it fascinated the Victorians. They saw in the spiral a natural inclination toward equilibrium, and suspension bridges, in their eyes, were doing the same thing, finding their own soft curve toward balance. It was a bold leap to connect tea dynamics with structural engineering. But then again, the Victorians were never afraid of a bold leap, as long as they could land it with a firm handshake and a cup of Earl Grey. The inspiration led to experiments. Engineers modeled suspension bridge shapes not with chalk and ruler, but with string in water, or silk suspended between weighted spoons. And they observed the natural catenary, the curve a hanging chain makes under its own weight. It's a beautiful shape, mathematically pure, but tricky to calculate. Unless, of course, you let tea leaves show you the way. One particularly eccentric design even used strands of boiled spaghetti, draped between teacups, to study tension under simulated weight. It didn't survive long, but it was delicious while it lasted. Scientists still argue whether any practical knowledge came from these experiments. But what they do agree on is that it opened up a mental model that engineers had never quite seen before. Structures that didn't resist forces, but flowed with them. Suspension bridges became a quiet obsession among Victorian thinkers. The Clifton Suspension Bridge, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, became a crown jewel of the era, spanning the Avon Gorge with impossible grace. Some whispered, entirely without evidence, that Brunel once watched a teabag string curve across his cup and murmured, "That's it." Probably not true, but isn't it better to imagine it is? And here's a detail to lull you further. Those same bridges, inspired by hanging chains and swirling tea, are some of the most stable in existence. Even when wind howls and weight presses down, the force distributes across every cable like fingers across a harp. No single point bears the burden alone. It's a lesson Victorian engineers found mirrored in the quiet patterns of their evening rituals. You gently picture them now, seated along long oak tables, diagrams spread beside saucers and shortbread. They discuss tension and load capacity between bites. They trace the curves of bridges with one hand while stirring sugar with the other. It was an age when work and wonder coexisted peacefully, and where one's best ideas might float to the surface in a quiet moment of observation. There's something deeply human about this. Even today, modern engineers draw lines on touchscreens and simulate load in digital clouds. But the underlying principles remain unchanged. Gravity hasn't updated, tension hasn't revised itself. The universe still favors balance, still teaches us through motion, repetition, and stillness. The Victorians didn't always get it right. Some bridges collapsed, others never left the blueprint. But in their tea-leaf logic, they found a serenity to the chaos. They learned that sometimes, to solve a great challenge, you need to watch something very small behave beautifully. You stretch slightly in your imaginary chair, thoughts draping like cable over towers. The suspension bridge is no longer a technical marvel. It's a lullaby in iron, a sleepy arc between two places, an idea made visible, just like a teacup gently cooling beside a candle's flicker. So let your thoughts sag softly, like suspension cables under twilight tension. Let your breathing find its natural curve. Let the world pull gently, and let yourself yield, not snap. You are not meant to bear every weight alone. The Victorians understood this, and tonight, through the quiet grace of a teacup and the sleeping strength of a bridge, perhaps you do too. Your imaginary drawing room is dim now, lit only by the smoldering glow of the fireplace and the silver hush of moonlight sliding through lace curtains. Outside, the rain has paused, leaving everything slick and hushed, like the world is holding its breath. You're deep into this strange and lovely tale of tea and tension, but just when you thought it couldn't get more curious, it's time to meet the man who may, or may not, have taken tea-fueled engineering to a whole new level, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now, before you drift too far into dreamland, let's set the scene. Brunel was a legend of the Victorian age. Compact in stature, famously dapper, and perpetually photographed looking like he just won a duel with gravity itself. He built railways, tunnels, and steamships the size of whales. He was engineering's answer to a Victorian rock star, with a stovepipe hat instead of a guitar, and a pocket watch that probably ticked in iambic pentameter. But what many people forget, or have the good sense never to claim, is that Brunel may have had a peculiar affection for tea, not just drinking it, contemplating it, whispering to it, maybe even sketching structural load diagrams in the drips of condensed steam on his saucers. Historians don't exactly confirm this, but they also don't deny it loudly enough to ruin the fun. You picture him now, perched at the edge of a tea table, his coat just slightly unbuttoned from hours of sketching iron hulls and bridge supports. He stares deeply into his cup of smoky lapsang souchong, brow furrowed, watching the leaves settle. Perhaps he notices how they drift inward, or form a little crescent like a suspension cable drawn by nature's hand. Maybe he whispers, "Yes, that's the curve." Or maybe he just mutters, "Too much sugar," and moves on. Either way, you like imagining he found something there. Brunel's designs were undeniably ahead of their time. His bridges, especially the Clifton Suspension Bridge, combined brute strength with ballet-like balance. The arching cables, the tapering towers, the careful spread of load across elegant geometry. They all bore the hallmark of a man who saw more than math in a structure. He saw beauty, he saw rhythm, and, if we're being delightfully speculative, he may have seen a little bit of tea. There's an old, possibly apocryphal story that Brunel once requested a break in the middle of a design session because the tea wasn't ready, and therefore neither was the bridge. Whether or not this ever happened is beside the point. It should have, because it speaks to something real, the idea that inspiration requires pause, that you can't brute force brilliance. Sometimes you have to let it steep. Scientists still argue whether Brunel truly used organic patterning in his designs, or whether we're just retrofitting poetry into blueprints. Some modern engineers point out that his bridges follow pure mathematical principles, not botanical ones. Others, though, note the undeniable elegance of his forms, the way his suspension curves mimic the parabolas seen in vines or the branches of a banyan tree. And then there's the curious fact that Brunel often chose his materials and designs based on how they behaved under flex, not just load. He wanted things to bend gracefully, not just stand stubbornly. He prized tension distribution, how forces flowed, not just where they landed. In short, he wanted his bridges to feel alive. And if you think back to how a tea leaf drifts before settling, or how surface tension gently balances chaos, you can see why such natural metaphors appealed to him. One of Brunel's assistants, in a letter never published, but later quoted in a footnote somewhere very dusty, wrote, "The man was fascinated with arcs. Everything needed to flow. A truss should not merely stand, it should agree with itself. Sometimes I think he designed like a violinist plays, drawing tension through form, then releasing it. That may sound more like a romance novel than an engineering manual, but perhaps that's the point. The Victorians saw no reason to separate utility from beauty. Even today, engineers look at Brunel's work and marvel, not just at the strength of his bridges, but their serenity. They seem to know how they're supposed to stand. Their form isn't fighting gravity, it's making peace with it. That's a tea leaf principle if ever there was one. Yield where you must, but settle into strength. Of course, not everything Brunel built worked. One of his massive steamships, perhaps designed after too much oolong, sank with a tragic sigh. Another project nearly bankrupted him, and yet he kept going. Because, like a good cup of tea, a good idea sometimes takes a second steeping to reveal its flavor. Brunel knew this, and he embraced the delays, the detours, the drafting table daydreams. His legacy isn't one of flawless execution, it's one of fearless imagination. You sit now, teacup balanced gently on your knee, picturing Brunel in his study, boots up on a stool, tea cooling beside a blueprint smudged with ash. He's humming, probably something faintly operatic, and redrawing a single cable line for the 7th time. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't feel right yet. He stirs his tea, watches the spiral, and tries again. There's comfort in that image, a reminder that even geniuses need to pause, to sip, to wait for the moment when the swirling stops and the pattern reveals itself. You let that thought steep inside you as your breathing slows. You've seen so many bridges tonight, some strong, some strange, some swaying like lullabies across vast chasms of time. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you feel stuck, you'll pour yourself a cup, stir it slowly, and watch the leaves settle. Because Brunel may not have been a tea mystic, but he understood something essential. Some of the best designs come from the quiet space between thoughts. The coals in your imaginary fireplace glow like soft embers of memory, too lazy to flicker, content just to warm the room in slow waves. Outside, mist clings to the cobblestones like sleep to your thoughts. You've wandered far tonight, across bridges, through parlor debates, into the gentle nonsense of Victorian tea logic. But now you stand at the quiet edge of failure, because even in this story of elegance and swirling inspiration, not everything held up. Some Victorian bridges, for all their tea-fueled wonder, collapsed. And they didn't always do so dramatically, no thunderous cinematic falls into stormy rivers. Sometimes they simply gave up. A beam buckled, a cable snapped, a foundation, laid during an unusually optimistic summer, shifted just enough to create a silent, slow-rolling disaster. You might think that such failures would discredit tea leaf theories forever, but instead they became part of the education. Victorians were unusually gracious with their mistakes, at least the engineering ones. A bridge collapse wasn't just a catastrophe, it was a lesson in materials, stress, hubris, and humility. Often, it started with the tiniest oversight, an anchor point misjudged, a rivet slightly off-center, a beautiful curve that wasn't quite mathematically sound. You imagine an engineer standing at the edge of one such bridge after the fact, his top hat in hand, his shoes coated in river silt. He's frowning, not in embarrassment, but in contemplation. He might mutter. So the wind load during the equinox was significant after all. A moment later, he reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out a tea tin. Because even after failure, some rituals are non-negotiable. These quiet collapses weren't always tragic. Many occurred during testing phases or light usage. The Victorians were methodical, even when chaos crept in. One particularly famous incident involved a wooden beam bridge that warped during a particularly humid summer in Kent. Locals reported hearing a strange creaking, followed by an elegant sigh. No one was injured. The bridge simply sank one end into the mud and refused to go on. Scientists still argue whether these failures were due to overconfidence in organic inspiration or just the natural growing pains of an era experimenting at the edge of known physics. The truth, as always, likely rests somewhere between. Victorians didn't always separate aesthetics from structure. If a bridge looked graceful, they believed it must also be strong, like thinking a pastry is nutritious because it's symmetrical. In one famous case, an engineer insisted on designing a bridge entirely around a spiral seen in his teacup. The resulting structure looked lovely on the sketch, resembling a nautilus shell laid out over a marsh. In reality, it twisted too tightly and couldn't support even modest weight. It failed during its first winter, when frost crept into the joints and gently pulled the structure apart like warm taffy. Locals named it the Snail. Some still call the field where it once stood Mollusk Meadow. But failure didn't mean giving up. On the contrary, Victorians embraced failure the way gardeners embrace compost. They didn't bury their mistakes. They built on them. Engineers would gather in oak-paneled rooms, diagrams spread across the table, scones nearby, and dissect every flawed joint. They spoke in soft tones, not because they were ashamed, but because they were civilized. Even a fallen bridge deserved respect. Over time, these failures refined their instincts. They began to recognize the limits of metaphor. Tea leaves could inspire, but not replace calculation. A graceful spiral was not always a structurally sound one. Engineers stopped drawing directly from the cup, and instead asked why the patterns formed as they did. They began studying flow, stress distribution, and the deeper mechanics behind the beauty. The tea leaves had started the conversation, but math would carry it forward. You sip your own imaginary tea now, quietly cooled. It's comforting to know that even the most elegant ideas can falter and still be worth having. The Victorians didn't shy away from that. They understood that wisdom often arrives disguised as error. You don't learn to build perfect bridges by succeeding every time. You learn by watching where they bend, where they give, where they sigh into the earth and whisper, "Try again." Even in failure, Victorian bridges told stories, sometimes literal ones, etched into plaques that read, "Redesigned after the incident of '72. Other times the stories were passed down verbally, the tale of the bridge that twisted in the night, or the one that sank just enough to give passing geese a shortcut. These weren't cautionary tales. They were part of the lore. Because what's more Victorian than learning from your mistakes? with impeccable manners. Today, many of those failed designs survive in blueprints tucked away in archives, their ink faded, but their ambition intact. Modern engineers study them with the same reverence given to ancient manuscripts, not because they want to copy them, but because they respect the bravery of trying something new, even if it didn't last more than a season. You lean further back into your chair now, heavy with the knowledge that perfection was never the goal. The Victorian dream wasn't just to build bridges, it was to understand why some stood and others didn't. And if that understanding came with a side of lemon biscuits and a cracked porcelain teacup, all the better. So let yourself drift now, not toward flawless arches or unbreakable cables, but toward that soft, forgiving space where ideas are allowed to wobble, where beauty and failure share a quiet laugh, where the bridge doesn't always have to hold, it just has to inspire the next one to be better. The tea leaves may have misled them once or twice, but they also led them here. And tonight, they've led you somewhere just as lovely, the edge of sleep, where even collapse is gentle, and even broken bridges know they mattered. The fire in your Victorian drawing room has faded into a bed of glowing embers, warm, steady, no longer crackling for attention. Outside, the rain has returned, not in torrents, but in soft, sleepy whispers against the glass. You sit with your legs tucked under a knitted throw, staring at your teacup one last time. The leaves inside haven't moved in ages. They've settled into a shape that might be a question mark, or a snail, or perhaps just the quiet echo of everything you've heard tonight. But we're not done yet. Because for all the elegance, the quiet failures, the swirling metaphors, and the calm engineering debates, there's one thing Victorians did exceptionally well: spreading their ideas around the world. And yes, some of those ideas, surprisingly or not, included the soft echoes of tea leaf-inspired bridge design. Let's take a little sleepy tour, shall we? You don't need your shoes, just drift. First stop, India. A land with its own deep tea traditions, where British engineers, drenched in humidity and colonial optimism, began constructing vast railway networks. Bridges were a necessity here, stretching across monsoonal rivers and deep valleys. Some of the engineers stationed here had been trained in the same drawing rooms and lecture halls we've visited tonight. And while it's unclear whether tea leaf metaphors were openly taught in imperial engineering syllabi, the structural decisions they made often mirrored those same branching patterns and flowing stress distributions. One engineer even documented how the swelling of wet leaves in Darjeeling reminded him of iron expansion during hot summers. He noted it in the margins of his field log, right next to an entry that reads, "Elephant again on track. Delayed 2 hours. Science and wildlife, politely colliding." Next, you're drifting gently toward Africa, where the Victorians built bridges through savannas and across canyon ridges, frequently testing materials under conditions they never faced back home. Here, the bridges had to contend with dramatic heat shifts, termite interference, and curious giraffes. So designs had to be not only strong, but adaptive. And once again, engineers began to appreciate patterns, especially those that allowed for natural flexibility. Some truss systems mirrored fern fronds, others looked like stretched spider webs. Engineers sketched them, modified them, and sometimes noted that their forms resembled the way tea cooled in a shallow saucer. Coincidence? Probably, but delightful nonetheless. You pause now in South America, a lesser-known but equally compelling site of Victorian bridgework. Over gorges and dense jungle rivers, engineers found themselves designing with materials that behaved differently than expected. Steel sometimes warped. Timber swelled. The solutions? Lighter frameworks, curved understructures, load-spreading beams that echoed, if only vaguely, the flowing shapes seen in botanical structures. One report from a railway project in Peru references organic distribution models. No one defined exactly what that meant, but if you've followed the tea leaves this far, you know. Back to Europe then. Because even at home, not all bridges were designed for grandeur. In sleepy villages and over lazy brooks, Victorian engineers built modest crossings, footbridges and canal spans that incorporated curved bracing, leaf-like arches, and decorative ironwork that doubled as load-bearing forms. You could walk across them in seconds and never know the invisible elegance supporting your step. That's the charm of the era, grace without announcement. And it wasn't just bridges. The same engineers, fueled by long afternoons and questionable tea biscuits, went on to build train stations, greenhouses, and even early factories with the same quiet principles. Arched glass roofs, supported by slender iron ribs that curved like plant stems. Drainage systems inspired by root patterns. It turns out, once you begin seeing structure in natural things, you don't stop at bridges. Scientists still argue whether this global spread of tea-inspired design was conscious or accidental. Were engineers explicitly copying leaf patterns, or were they simply trained to recognize nature's solutions wherever they were posted? Either way, the influence traveled, whispered its way from cups to continents. A bridge here, a trellis there, a truss that seemed to bend just a little more kindly than the rest. And through all this, tea remained the quiet constant. Whether sipped in British parlors or railway tents in Tanzania, it was always there, steaming softly, swirling gently, waiting to be noticed. You imagine an engineer, resting after hours of drafting under the dim glow of an oil lamp. The day's heat still radiates off stone. In their hand, a chipped mug. In the mug, an old idea, steeping once more. You let this thought settle into you, that even the grandest ideas can begin with something small, that inspiration can cross oceans not in speeches or battles, but in habits, simple, repetitive, and quietly shared. That you can build a bridge across the world simply by showing someone how to see. There's something comforting in that, something gentle, the kind of wisdom that doesn't shout, that doesn't need steel towers or flashing lights, just a cup and a moment and the willingness to watch. As you sit back now, heavy with quiet knowledge, you feel the miles you've traveled, the bridges you've crossed, the rain in every country, the softness beneath each design. You haven't moved an inch, and yet you've wandered the world on the slow current of tea and time. Let that journey rest in you now. Let your breath mirror the slow arc of a suspension cable. Let your thoughts branch outward like the veins of a leaf. Let the world, in all its strange and swirling logic, feel beautifully connected for just this moment longer. And as you drift deeper, know this, the bridges are still standing. There's a silence now that feels earned. The kind of hush that settles over a room, not because it's empty, but because everyone has said exactly what needed to be said. You remain in your imaginary Victorian drawing room, the fire now no more than a warm breath across the floor. The rain outside has become a soft static, less weather, more lullaby. And tonight, as your thoughts grow softer, you turn your gaze from blueprints and bridges to the people behind them, the societies, the salons, the tea rooms where the real engineering sometimes happened. Because let's be honest, while the grand bridges may have gotten the attention, the conversations that birthed them often took place in far humbler places. In back rooms of engineering societies, in gently creaking chairs near fireplace nooks, or, increasingly, in the soft confines of Victorian tea rooms, where sugar was passed with more ceremony than laws. Victorian tea rooms were strange and lovely spaces. Half social parlor, half low-stakes symposium. You entered not just to sip, but to think, to chat, to reflect, and sometimes to sketch something quietly brilliant on a napkin just before the waitress arrived with the third scone. You imagine one now. The wallpaper is floral, but slightly faded. There are doilies absolutely everywhere. A piano leans against one wall, unused but somehow smug. And in the far corner, three engineers huddle around a table littered with sketches, teaspoons, and a growing tower of mismatched saucers. They're arguing, not loudly, but with the kind of intensity normally reserved for long chess matches or poetry readings. The topic? Whether the bracing pattern of a certain truss more closely resembles the ribbing of a leaf or the veining of a butterfly wing. One of them insists on consulting the tea leaves in his cup. Another uses the sugar tongs to gesture toward a drawn parabola. The third? She's quietly sketching something far better than either of them, her pen gliding steadily while they debate. Because yes, despite the stereotypes, women were increasingly present in these rooms, not just as observers, but as contributors, thinkers, designers. The Victorian age was quietly filled with brilliant women working under far too much silence, but here, in the safe murmur of tea and topic, their ideas had room to grow. Scientists still argue how much actual science happened in tea rooms, but what they don't debate is this. They were places of possibility, a space where rigid titles and roles melted away, if only for an hour, where ideas, like steam, rose freely before being captured again, distilled into theories, scribbles, and eventually sometimes bridges. The engineering societies of the time, grand halls with oak panels and slightly too many oil portraits, also played their role. But they were more performative, structured. You wore your best waistcoat. You presented your work with exactly the right amount of humility. You referenced Sir Isaac Newton at least once. It was expected. The tea room, on the other hand, expected only that you showed up thirsty and curious. It was in these informal meetings that many structural philosophies quietly emerged. The question wasn't, what did you publish? But, have you thought about what happens when the wind hits the bridge sideways? You'd sip, consider, and maybe answer, or maybe just nod and say, let's walk to the river tomorrow and watch. There was something sacred in that slowness, something honest in the sideways, tea-damp conversations that circled problems like cats circling a chair. These weren't eureka moments with violin crescendos. They were gentle murmurings, scone-fueled hypotheses, theories steeped longer than necessary. One account from the era describes a group of engineers who, frustrated by a particularly uncooperative design, decided to adjourn their official meeting and reconvene at a nearby tea room. They brought their notes. They brought a model. They brought nothing new except a sense of ease. And there, away from the polished floors and echoing lecture halls, they solved it. A new type of truss, one that reduced lateral stress by mimicking the curved underside of a maple leaf. They named it, informally of course, the tea room solution. We don't know if it was ever patented, but we know it worked, because sometimes pressure is the enemy of progress, and the gentle absurdity of sipping Ceylon while redesigning iron frameworks is exactly what Victorian brilliance looked like. Even the decor played its part. Patterns on curtains mirrored the veins of leaves. China patterns echoed the arches of bridges. Lace shadows flickered across diagrams, suggesting new cross-bracing ideas. Nothing was off limits. Inspiration was ambient. It lived in the background noise, in the warmth of the pot, in the simple comfort of being together with minds that were allowed to wander. Today we think of innovation as a lonely grind. But the Victorians, whether they knew it or not, had already mastered collaborative dreaming. They built not just bridges between places, but bridges between ideas, people, and moments. Some of those bridges still stand. Others dissolved quietly into tea stains and forgotten minutes, but they mattered all the same. You breathe deeply now, your own room filled with imaginary steam. The tea room, with its murmur and sugar, fades slowly behind your eyes. But its lesson lingers. that invention need not always arrive loudly, that some of the strongest structures begin in the quiet company of warmth, patience, and shared curiosity. So tonight, let your thoughts settle like silt in a cup. Let your problems steep in gentleness. And remember that even your most absurd ideas, if shared over tea, might quietly become something lasting. You're nearly floating now, as if suspended from invisible cables like the bridges you've imagined all night long. Each breath swings a little lower, a little slower, like a pendulum forgetting its job. The rain outside has softened into fog. The fire, reduced to a faint blush behind the grate, barely stirs. And yet, we have one more detour before crossing the threshold into dreams. One more room to visit. A less serious, slightly dustier corner of Victorian history, where the boundaries of science bent gently under the weight of fringe curiosity. Welcome to the world of tea-fueled nonsense, or as the Victorians might have called it, speculative structural philosophy. You step quietly into a study that smells like pipe tobacco and forgotten experiments. There's a man here, mustache too large to be trustworthy, explaining earnestly how different tea blends produce different structural ideas. Ceylon for tension, Assam for arch support. Darjeeling is for inspiration. Never build a cantilever on Darjeeling. He taps a chalkboard covered in what can only be described as spirals inside spirals. It's a bridge design, technically, though it looks suspiciously like a croissant with ambition. You nod politely. Because the Victorians, for all their rigorous science, also loved a good theory that made absolutely no sense, and then defended it like it was their birthright. Some of these ideas were charming, others were laughable, a few utterly baffling. There was, for instance, a belief among a small group of engineers that the angle at which one pours tea affects one's capacity for accurate structural analysis. They claimed that pouring from a height improved spatial reasoning. Some even held small elevation competitions, raising their teapots dangerously high before a drop even hit the cup. One man poured from nearly shoulder height, broke a saucer, and declared it a breakthrough in dynamic load testing. Then there was the echo theory, a wholly unsupported idea that the shape of teacups could influence acoustics on suspension bridges. The theory proposed that the delicate vibrations formed by clinking porcelain mimicked the oscillations of bridge cables under foot traffic. They tried to prove it with tuning forks and a highly controversial cello performance conducted on a half-finished viaduct. Spoiler, it did not work. Scientists still argue whether these ideas were sincere or satirical. Some believe these fringe theorists were poking fun at more serious colleagues, parodying the trend of finding natural metaphors in everything. Others insist they were completely earnest and simply had an unusually poetic understanding of physics. Whatever the truth, the papers were written, the diagrams drawn, and the teacups forever honored with wildly inappropriate scientific weight. There was even a short-lived journal, the Illustrated Quarterly of Thermally Infused Mechanics, which devoted entire volumes to things like T-vortex asymmetry and the symmetrical decay of leaf-stirred liquid vectors. It folded after only 3 issues, probably due to a lack of funding or an overabundance of sarcasm, but the footnotes live on in engineering folklore. One favorite tale involves a duo who tried to map entire transportation networks based on the Fibonacci spiral observed in their teacup after a particularly vigorous stir. Their resulting blueprint connected Edinburgh to Lisbon via a corkscrew loop that made absolutely no practical sense but was mathematically elegant. When challenged, they simply replied, "Elegance always precedes efficiency." They were promptly not invited back to the Royal Society that year. And yet, you sense something sweet beneath the absurdity. These fringe theories, however impractical, revealed a deep longing for order in chaos. The Victorians weren't trying to be silly. They were trying to find patterns in a rapidly changing world. Steam engines, telegraphs, and steel were transforming society. A swirling teacup was a comfort, a known quantity. If it could whisper solutions to complex problems, even metaphorically, then it was worth listening to. Besides, it wasn't all nonsense. Every once in a while, a ludicrous idea contained a tiny, accidental truth. The observation that heat rises unevenly in a cup did lead to better ventilation designs. The theory that cup shape affected vibration, wrong about bridges, but oddly useful in musical instrument design. Even the pouring height debate hinted at early understandings of fluid dynamics. So while mainstream engineers frowned, chuckled, and occasionally sighed into their shortbread, they also listened. Just a little. Because sometimes inspiration hides in silliness. Sometimes the fringe nudges the center forward. And as you sit now, gently amused, you realize something else. These quirks, these oddball theories, are what made Victorian engineering so wonderfully human. They weren't just building structures, they were daydreaming through them. Testing the limits of imagination, even when it meant stirring their tea a little too dramatically or assigning moral characteristics to oolong blends. You may not remember all the terms they used. You may forget the dimensions of a catenary or the modulus of elasticity, but you'll remember this feeling, the charm of a time when people stared into cups and saw ideas. When science could be serious and silly, when a diagram could be precise and still shaped like a fern. Let that warmth settle in you now. Let the oddities and gentle nonsense curl around your thoughts like steam rising from a freshly poured pot. You are drifting through an era where curiosity reigned, even when it led nowhere in particular. And as your eyes begin to close, know this. It's okay not to make sense all the time. Even the strangest ideas might carry you somewhere beautiful. Even the wildest tea leaf pattern might quietly resemble a bridge that lasts 100 years. The night is thick now, soft and uninterrupted. Your imaginary drawing room seems to breathe with you, slowly, rhythmically, as though the furniture itself is relaxing. The fire has reduced to a faint whisper of warmth. Your teacup, forgotten on the side table, has grown stone cold. But even now, your thoughts flow like those old bridges, arching forward with gentle insistence. Tonight, you arrive in the modern age, quietly tracing the echoes of Victorian tea logic as they ripple into today's engineering. Because yes, oddly enough, the ideas stirred up in those drawing rooms and tea salons haven't entirely vanished. In fact, some of them are hiding in plain sight, built into the elegant bones of the modern world. You begin by strolling sleepily across a sleek footbridge in Copenhagen. It's all brushed steel and glass panels, curves and light. Beneath your feet, invisible stress flows through tensioned cables arranged in soft spirals. Look closer, and you'll see something familiar. The stress lines mimic the same radial patterns that leaves once formed in Brunel's teacup. Coincidence? Scientists still argue, but the designer cited organic stress dispersal principles in an interview. And if that doesn't sound like Victorian nonsense dressed in a black turtleneck, what does? Next, you wander to Singapore, where vertical gardens sprawl across high-rise buildings. Their supporting framework? A fine web of steel ribs, graceful, leaf-like, branching outward with natural logic. Inspired by nature, yes, but perhaps also inspired by the idea that strength doesn't require bulk. That load can be carried lightly if distributed well. Victorian engineers would nod solemnly and murmur something about hibiscus leaf tension vectors. Modern architects just call it biophilic design. Then, quietly, you drift into digital spaces, because the echoes aren't limited to physical structures. In computational architecture, where AI helps design organic forms, you'll find algorithms that mimic natural flow. How a tree disperses weight, how a lily petal curves under rain. You even find simulations of fluid movement eerily similar to the patterns that form in a stirred cup of tea. The very concept of computational fluid dynamics, which now helps test everything from airplane wings to sports cars, sometimes begins with models so simple they resemble tea leaves in a mug. That idea, that great complexity can arise from simple beginnings, is a Victorian thought through and through. They didn't call it fractals or emergent behavior. They called it elegant design, and they practiced it with rulers and string and the occasional biscuit. Some modern bridge designs are more explicit about their roots. One cable-stayed bridge in Japan, the Yumi no Tsurubashi, features suspension lines that arc outward in delicate symmetry, designed to mirror cherry blossom branches. Its engineers described the visual as a calm invitation across water. But the real story? The project's lead designer was quoted as saying he often watched tea swirl in his cup when stuck on design problems. He wasn't Victorian, but he may as well have been. Engineers today still balance the old forces, tension, compression, balance, but now they talk about stress testing, fatigue life, vibrational damping. It's faster, more precise, less poetic. Yet the core challenge remains. How do you get a structure to stand up and feel like it belongs there? That's where the Victorians still whisper. Their influence isn't just in physical patterns. It's in the mindset, the willingness to pause, to look, to find inspiration in the quiet, slow swirl of a drink, to believe that grace matters just as much as math. Scientists still argue whether modern biomimicry owes a direct debt to tea leaf observation. The line from Victorian parlor to AI-designed bridge is crooked, maybe even tangled. But the spirit is shared. The belief that the world's softest patterns might teach us how to build its strongest structures. That beauty isn't ornamental, it's instructive. And even outside of engineering, the tea-inspired logic shows up in unexpected places. In microchip design, where pathways mimic root networks. In packaging, where folded cardboard follows the same crease logic as fern fronds. Even in the way your phone antenna curves gently around its frame, subtle, non-intrusive, and built to absorb stress. You lean back, imagining how delighted our tea-sipping Victorians would be to see it all. "We told you," they'd say, not smugly, but with the calm satisfaction of someone whose sketch on a napkin finally built a skyscraper. Their world, with all its peculiarities and soft eccentricities, quietly shaped this one. And that's perhaps the most comforting realization of the night. That quiet ideas don't just vanish, they ripple, they settle, and sometimes, when the world is ready, they rise again, redesigned, renamed, and wrapped in titanium. But still, underneath it all, a cup of tea. So the next time you cross a bridge that feels elegant, or see a structure that seems to know where its stress belongs, pause a moment. There's a good chance a Victorian mind once stirred a spoon, watched the swirl, and saw it too. Let that knowledge nestle into you now. Let it root somewhere gentle. You're no longer just a dreamer drifting through stories. You're part of the lineage, a soft link in the great chain of thinking, building, noticing. And tonight, as the modern world hums softly behind your thoughts, and the bridges of the past still stand, you close your eyes knowing this. We never really leave behind the strange, lovely ideas that started in teacups. It's so quiet now you can almost hear the dust settling in your thoughts. The rain has stopped. The fire has gone out entirely, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth in the bricks. You're wrapped in shadows and softness, deeper into sleep than not. But before we dim the lights for good, there's one last cup of tea to sip. One final, gentle reflection on the peculiar, beautiful legacy of bridges born in porcelain. You return once more to the beginning. A cup, a leaf, a pattern. All night you've followed those leaves from the bottom of a Victorian teacup to the steel bones of suspension bridges, across continents, through failures, ideas, and quiet debates. You've watched engineers squint into their mugs and sketch whole blueprints with one hand while cradling a saucer in the other. You've seen their theories, some brilliant, some bizarre, linger like steam in a cold room. Now, as your mind slows to a crawl, you take in the full picture. Tea didn't build the bridges, but it made people pause long enough to think differently about them. That, in many ways, is the true magic. Not the leaves, not the swirls, but the pause, the slowing, the act of sitting down, allowing your mind to wander, to settle, to see things you wouldn't in the rush of hammer and steel. Scientists still argue whether tea leaf-inspired design belongs in the official engineering canon. There are no textbooks with chapters titled Steeped Structures or The Darjeeling Method for Load Distribution, though someone really should write that. But the traces are there. Not in equations, but in attitude, in a willingness to let nature whisper the answers, even if she does it through breakfast. And so the bridges stand not just as feats of engineering, but as quiet monuments to a different kind of intelligence. One that listens, one that waits, one that's willing to be a little ridiculous in the pursuit of something enduring. You imagine walking across one of these bridges now. It's dusk. The air is cool, but not unfriendly. Beneath your feet, the structure hums, alive with tension and balance. You don't hear it exactly, but you feel it, like a breath held just right. The cables rise in perfect arcs. The metal beneath your feet gives just a little, responding with grace. You pause halfway across, lean on the railing, and look out over the water. The surface is still, like tea in a forgotten cup. In the distance, the lights of a town blink on slowly, warm, familiar, rhythmic. There's no revelation here, no grand truth, just the gentle understanding that something small, something as simple as a leaf drifting in hot water, can shape the world, given enough patience. You remember Brunel staring into his cup, the Yorkshire Bridge nicknamed the Teacup Truss, the failed spiral span that never quite worked but still made people smile. You think of all the engineers who quietly passed their best ideas across tables, between bites of cake, who built with curiosity, humility, and the persistent belief that elegance was worth chasing. You are tired now, not just sleep-tired, but soul-tired, in the way that comes from seeing far and soft, the way that comes from remembering that the world is full of strange, lovely connections, that not everything has to be fast, that sometimes the most remarkable things begin with stillness. Let that stillness fill you now. Let your breath slow, your body sink. Let your mind drift gently across the bridges of memory, where tension and compression meet in perfect, silent balance. Nothing is rushing you. No load is too heavy. You are safe. You are quiet. You are exactly where you should be. And in case no one told you today, you've built enough. You've thought enough. You've done enough. Tonight, the world can wait. And now, as your body grows heavier and your thoughts become soft and wordless, allow everything you've heard tonight to simply settle, like the last swirling leaves in a teacup. Let the bridges fade from your mind, their elegant arches dissolving into dusk. Let the engineers go quiet, their sketches tucked away, their conversations turned to murmurs. Let even the tea cool in its cup, forgotten for now, as you surrender to something slower, something deeper. You are not required to remember every fact or every name. Not every spiral must be traced. Not every cable must hold. What matters is the feeling, the calm recognition that beauty and balance often begin in the smallest things. Let your breath mimic that balance now, in and out, just like a suspension cable swaying gently in the night breeze. In and out. You're safe. You're supported. You're allowed to rest. If a thought floats through, let it drift past like steam, noticed, then gone. Let the room go dim. Let the stories go still. You've walked far tonight, across bridges made not just of iron and stone, but of imagination and ease. And now it's time to sleep. Let go. The world, with all its swirling questions and brilliant nonsense, will still be here tomorrow. But for now, let it fade. Let everything fade. You've crossed the last bridge. You've reached the quiet side.